At 3:15 a.m. on August 14, 2025, a vessel docked at Olia port in Russia's Astrakhan region. It was not an ordinary ship, but a logistics carrier that had crossed the Caspian from Iran, carrying supplies Moscow depends on. Inside were drone components, electronic parts, and fuel, materials tied directly to Russia's air campaign against Ukraine. For years, this corridor had been treated as untouchable. Olia port, sitting more than 500 kilometers inside Russian territory, was believed to be beyond the reach of Ukrainian attacks. It served as a secure link where shipments from Iran could be offloaded and fed into Russia's war machine. The confidence came not only from distance but from the assumption that drones could not penetrate so far. That belief was about to be tested. The docking of Port Olia 4 was supposed to be routine, with cranes ready to unload containers and warehouses prepared to store equipment. But the importance of its cargo made the ship far more than a cargo vessel. It symbolized Moscow's reliance on Iranian weapons and the fragile chain that keeps its strikes going. Dozens of Shahed drones, their engines, spare parts, and the fuel to power them were reportedly inside, enough to keep bombardments running for weeks. That cargo turned the Port Olia 4 into one of the most valuable assets on the Caspian route, resting in a port Russia considered safe. What happened next would test that assumption and reveal just how vulnerable this lifeline had become. The Olia port sits on the edge of the Volga Delta, where the Great River meets the Caspian Sea, and for years it has been treated as one of Russia's safest logistical hubs. From this dock, hundreds of kilometers from any battlefield, Moscow believed it could quietly unload the cargo that fuels its war effort without risk of interruption. At more than 500 kilometers, or roughly 400 miles, inside Russian territory, Olia seemed protected by distance itself. It was not close to the front lines in Ukraine, nor was it in a region often linked to open conflict. That sense of security is exactly why it became so important for the Russian supply chain. The port is positioned in the Volga Delta, a stretch of waterways and infrastructure that gives Russia direct access to Caspian shipping lanes. These lanes connect Russian territory with Iran, a partner that has been providing Moscow with Shahed drones, their engines, and the electronic parts needed to keep them flying. Olia turned into the reception point for those shipments, the place where containers from the Iranian coast could be offloaded and then routed into Russia's military system. Every vessel that arrived carried the promise of more drone strikes on Ukraine's power grid, fuel depots, and industrial centers. This made the port not just a commercial dock, but a vital node in the machinery of war. To understand the weight of this location, one has to see how it fits into the larger logistics picture. Russian ground forces depend on steady flows of equipment, and the drone campaign is no exception. Without Olia, the link between Iranian factories and Russian strike units would be broken or at least badly weakened. The British Ministry of Defense noted in one of its regular briefings that the port's location reveals something crucial. Ukraine can now hit targets far deeper than before. When drones can travel 500 to 640 kilometers past the border, it calls into question the real reach of Russia's air defense network. Systems like the Panzer S-1 or Buk M3 may guard individual bases, but they cannot form a shield that covers every strategic hub spread across Russia's vast landmass. The strike at Olia exposed that gap in a dramatic way. For years, Russian planners assumed that geography gave them a buffer zone. Now, even the Caspian corridor, once described as untouchable, has been shown to be within reach. This changes not only how Russia must defend its supply lines, but also how Ukraine can project its power. The choice of Olia as a target sent a clear signal. Nowhere is completely secure, and even the heart of Russia's logistics can be put at risk. It is a message designed to shake confidence as much as to destroy cargo. When a supply chain link so deep inside the country is struck, It forces commanders to reconsider their maps, their assumptions, and their priorities. It also signals to outside observers that Ukraine's drone program has moved to a new stage, one where distance is no longer a barrier. That realization will weigh heavily not only on Russian planners, but also on those watching how modern war evolves. At 3:15 a.m. on August 14, 2025, the Russian logistics vessel Port Olia 4 docked at Olia port in the Astrakhan region after a journey across the Caspian Sea from Iran. The ship displaced more than 13,000 tons and carried military cargo valued at over $22 million. Containers of Shahed suicide drones, large-caliber artillery shells, electronic components, reserve fuel tanks, and nearly 8 tons of explosives disguised as industrial goods. For Moscow, this was a lifeline, an artery in the drone supply chain. Olia was deep inside Russian territory, guarded by Buk M3 systems, Pantsir S-1 batteries, 96L-6 surveillance radar, and reconnaissance units. It was considered untouchable. What Russia did not know was that the entire voyage had been tracked by Ukrainian reconnaissance teams on the opposite Caspian shore. As cranes prepared to unload containers, the attack began. Ukraine launched a Lyuty-196 long-range UAV, carrying a 165-pound shaped charge warhead. It was not alone. 2 UJ-22 decoy drones flew ahead, broadcasting strong signals and pulling Russian radars toward them. The 3 machines advanced in a triangle formation, a tactic rehearsed through hundreds of reconnaissance flights. At 3:40 a.m., Russian sensors detected the decoys, and a Pantsir battery launched 257 E-6 missiles, destroying them. Crews sighed with relief, believing the threat eliminated. But that was the trap. While defenses recalibrated, the Lyuty drone banked 17 degrees, slipping through the seam where radar beams overlapped. It skimmed just above the Caspian surface, hidden by reflections from the pier walls. At 3:46 a.m., Ukrainian operators confirmed, Lyuty has entered the attack corridor. The final target appeared on screens, a vessel nearly 600 feet long, 90 feet wide, its deck loaded with Shahed containers. At 3:49 a.m., the UAV accelerated to 130 miles per hour and plunged into the port side. Impact came in a blinding flash. A fireball rose more than 300 feet, shockwaves ripping through steel thicker than 20 millimeters. Fuel tanks ignited instantly, creating pressure that tore open compartments. Secondary blasts erupted as drone containers detonated like artillery batteries. Cranes collapsed, warehouses caught fire, and trucks were thrown aside. By 4:15 a.m., Port Olia 4 was half submerged, its bow barely visible in the inferno. Satellite images released in the hours after the strike erased any remaining uncertainty. What had once been one of Russia's largest logistics vessels, the Port Olia 4, was reduced to a burned-out hulk sitting low in the water. Its bow faintly visible while the rest of the hull sagged under flames and flooding. The ship's superstructure was gone, collapsed into twisted metal and blackened steel. Pier 3, which only hours earlier had been filled with cranes and cargo trucks, was now warped and cratered. From above, the entire port looked less like a functioning logistics hub and more like an industrial zone devastated by bombardment. The UK Ministry of Defence noted in its daily briefing that the strike had paralyzed the entire hub, not just the ship. Even if salvage crews managed to stabilize Port Olia 4, the loss of basic equipment meant operations would remain frozen for weeks, if not longer. The wider disruption became visible almost immediately. Customs activity stopped as smoke still rose from the shoreline. Vessels arriving from Iran and Turkey were forced to anchor offshore, unable to unload their cargo. Satellite photographs showed multiple ships idling along the Caspian coast, evidence of a backlog that grew larger by the day. Each 24-hour period of closure stretched Moscow's supply chain thinner, complicating its ability to sustain long-range drone attacks. Inside the wreck, analysts estimated that hundreds of drones, engines, and explosives were lost. Intelligence suggested that more than 50 containers had carried Shahed-136 and Shahed-131 systems, equivalent to 2 to 3 weeks of Russia's strike capacity against Ukraine's grid and industry. With a single hit, Ukraine had erased weeks of planned bombardments targeting substations, thermal power plants, and fuel depots. The aftermath was not only visible in steel and fire, but in the paralysis of an entire corridor. Emergency teams struggled through the night, but suppression systems failed against the scale of the blaze. By dawn, large sections of Olia were in ruins. Images of collapsed cranes, buckled piers, and scorched warehouses circulated widely, leaving Moscow no room to deny the scale of the disaster. For Russia, reliance on Olia had turned into a critical vulnerability. A single drone had not only sunk a ship, but also crippled one of the main arteries connecting Iranian production lines to Russian strike units. For Ukraine, the strike was proof that deep penetration operations could shatter the illusion of safety hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory. The photographs broadcast worldwide carried a message as sharp as the explosion itself. Moscow's safe corridor on the Caspian was fragile, and the battlefield now stretched deep into what the Kremlin once called its secure rear. In the first hours after the explosion at Olia port, Moscow gave almost no detail. For 3 hours, official channels were silent, while pro-Kremlin outlets spoke only of a fire under investigation. By midday on August 14th, Ukraine reported to material damage at a civilian port on the Volga, but made no mention of the vessel or the strike. Satellite images quickly revealed the truth. They showed a large cargo ship burned out and sitting low in the water. Its superstructure was gone, twisted into blackened steel, and Pier 3 was warped and cratered. The scene confirmed that this was not an isolated fire, but the destruction of a major logistics hub. The target was Port Olia 4, a vessel central to Russia's supply chain. It had carried hundreds of Shahed drones, spare engines, guidance electronics, and explosive components shipped from Iran. The destruction meant the loss of at least 300 drones in one night, enough to sustain 2 or 3 weeks of Russia's strike capacity against Ukraine's energy and transport infrastructure. The operation also exposed weaknesses in Russian air defense. Systems like the Panzer S-1 and Buk M3 were positioned to protect Astrakhan. Yet Ukrainian forces used decoy drones to draw radar locks, opening blind corridors for the main strike UAV. The An-Liuti-196, flying low at medium speed, evaded detection and closed in on its target. The failure showed that even layered defenses could be bypassed with deception tactics. The impact was immediate. Authorities locked down Olia port for at least 72 hours, halting civilian and military docking. Additional Pantsir batteries and Podlet K-1 radars were deployed to patch the exposed gap. The transport of Shahed UAVs across the Caspian was suspended, cutting one of Moscow's most important supply routes. Emergency teams worked through the night but could not contain the fires. Secondary explosions from drone parts, aviation fuel, and munitions rained debris across the port. For Russia, reliance on Olia had turned into a critical weakness. For Ukraine, the strike erased weeks of planned bombardments and proved that deep strikes could reach hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory. On the night of August 14, 2025, the flames over Astrakhan showed that no rear area could be considered safe. The strike on Port Olia 4 was more than a single attack. It cut into Russia's supply chain. By reaching over 600 kilometers into Russian territory, Ukraine showed that the idea of a secure rear was no longer valid. For years, Moscow had treated the Caspian corridor as untouchable, a safe route for Iranian supplies. That assumption ended in one night, as long-range drones bypassed distance and struck a key logistics artery. The cargo made the loss severe. On board were Shahed drones, engines, ammunition, and specialized electronics from Iran. With those shipments destroyed, Moscow's ability to sustain long-range bombardments was reduced. Analysts estimated the loss equaled weeks of planned strikes against Ukraine's power grid and industry, operations that could no longer proceed. The destruction of Port Olia 4 meant not only damage to one ship, but the removal of an entire cycle of attacks. The disruption spread quickly. The flow of Iranian weapons across the Caspian was halted, leaving vessels offshore waiting to unload. Reports noted the strike was part of a broader Ukrainian strategy to sever the chain linking Iranian production with Russian strike units. Instead of intercepting drones in the air, Ukraine hit them at the source, targeting shipments before they reached the battlefield. Looking ahead, Russia faces costly adjustments. One option is to reroute cargo through the Black Sea, but that means operating in contested waters under surveillance. Another is to send supplies overland through the Caucasus, exposing convoys to sabotage and demanding heavy security. Both alternatives add risk, delay, and expense to a system already under strain. The attack on Olia was therefore more than the loss of a vessel. It signaled that Ukraine could strike deep and that geography no longer guaranteed safety. Every new shipment now faces uncertainty, and every delay increases pressure on Russia's drone campaign. The strike forced Moscow to confront the fragility of its reliance on Iran and the vulnerability of its logistics corridor. Russia now faces a difficult decision in the wake of the strike at Olia. One option is to reroute shipments through the Caucasus by land or across the Black Sea by ship, but both choices bring delays, higher costs, and new risks. Convoys overland are exposed to sabotage and require heavy security, while sea routes pass through waters already contested and monitored. What once seemed like a straight and secure corridor across the Caspian has turned into a dangerous gamble. Ukraine, on the other hand, has gained momentum. By proving that drones can hit targets more than 600 kilometers inside Russian territory, Kyiv has created a model it can repeat. Future operations could focus on other logistics hubs, depots, or ports, each strike weakening Moscow's ability to move weapons and fuel toward the front. Instead of fighting every drone in the sky, Ukraine is showing it can strike at the source, turning supply into the new battlefield. The strategic effect is already visible. Each gap in the chain is a chance for Ukraine to press harder, using cheaper weapons to cause expensive damage. On a global level, the meaning is unmistakable. The age of secure rear zones is ending. Low-cost, long-range UAVs have rewritten the rules, making no hub or port truly safe. The fire at Olia was not only a single strike, it was a warning that in modern war, the line between front and rear has all but disappeared.